Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So I'm finally up to the part in Thomas Smith's podcast where he starts to talk about the sentencing gap. Now I did criticise Thomas way back in episode 4 for not talking or knowing about the sentencing gap. The clip of that is here. So why would Tom dismiss men's issues despite the facts? I see there being two possibilities. The first is he knows about the gender sentencing gap but doesn't really care about equality and doesn't give a shit about men or our issues. The second possibility is he has never heard of the gender sentencing gap. Now it is true that Thomas came across as an asshole in his talk with Sargon, but I don't believe the first option is the correct one. I believe it's far more likely Tom has just never heard of the sentencing gap, which brings up a number of interesting points. Firstly, he's not a facts guy like he thinks he is. Secondly, the social justice movement, which he is so eager to defend, has only given him limited information concerning only certain groups, which has shaped his opinion of the world. And thirdly, the hostility he has shown towards people like Sargon and our side in general limits him from listening to our points of view and then taking them on board, really considering that he might be wrong and that we might be right, and changing his opinion. Now, to be fair, I am basing this off his talk with Sargon, his talk with Baring, and his talk with Kevin Logan. He may be different on his podcast, I don't know. But even if that were the case, and he really is just concerned about equality for all, then the social justice movement has let him down, as it has fed him a biased narrative of half-truths instead of facts like he thinks it has. It has put blinders on him. It has limited his vision to only certain groups having issues based on an ideological worldview, and any claim that doesn't fit the narrative is automatically shot down. So that video was published on November 17th, 2017, and then on December 7th, 2017, Thomas Smith published a podcast in which he actually did talk about the sentencing gap. And it's that part of the podcast that we'll be looking at today. And I have to give credit where credit is due. Thomas is at his fairest in this part of his podcast.
Okay, for the rest of this, I'm going to talk about one of the biggest issues that I don't know if it's biggest in terms of time in the film, but I think it is probably one of the best cases that MRAs have for men are being discriminated against. And I want to give it its due. It has to do with sentencing, where there's gender disparities in sentencing. So men get sentenced to more time, longer sentences than women for similar crimes. That's the claim made. I think this is likely one of the best cases that MRAs have, or people who care about these issues have, when it comes to like discrimination against men. I do think that there's a case to be made here. I want to look at it. I want to look at the data. I want to talk about some of the nuances of the data. There's some confounding issues to talk about. So that'll be the rest of the episode, is discussing this major issue, because I think it is major. And I want to make sure to steelman this. I really do want to do my best in all things to try to be fair. And the biggest source that I'm seeing, the most in-depth and the most referenced source I'm seeing, is a study by someone named Sonia Starr, who at the time of the study was an assistant law professor at the University of Michigan. Not sure what she's up to now, but that's where the study was done out of. Cutting to the punchline, this is the stat that MRAs reference. They say that men are sentenced to 63% longer on average than women for equivalent crimes, as can best be controlled. So 63%, that's a staggering number, very large, something that, if true, should definitely be of concern to every citizen. I mean, that's just a gigantic disparity. And it's probably unconstitutional, really, if two people in a protected class like sex are treated vastly differently in that way. That's something we should all be concerned about.
Now, I totally agree with Thomas. He makes some excellent points here. But I do have to bring up what he did say to Sargon.
Do you think there's discrimination against women in our society?
I'm absolutely certain that there will be someone somewhere who is being discriminated against. Do you think there's discrimination against men in our society?
Not really.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I don't know.
So if women are discriminated against this much, men this much, you don't care?
I don't care
Doesn't
because
matter.
I'm not a social engineer. I don't think, even, let's say, right, this...
And I have to ask, Thomas, do you still believe this? Do you still stand by those statements that you said to Sargon? Or has watching the Red Pill and listening to MRAs actually changed your mind a bit?
A couple things to talk about in terms of this study. First off, it's only federal court. So I'm looking at numbers here. Federal prisoners account for roughly 10% of total prisoners. I'm not sure how that would translate to total people who go through the system. There may be more who go through, the local systems that don't end up with sentences. So I don't have those numbers. I wasn't able to find how many people go through the system in total, but we can assume it's probably something like 10%. It's probably similar to the proportion in prison. Maybe not, but it should be somewhere in the ballpark. So I do want to point out that this data is only reflective of something like 10% of the total prison population. But still, there's no reason to suspect that if the federal numbers are so skewed toward men getting longer sentences, I don't know of any reason to suspect that it would be vastly different in state or local jails or whatever. I think that it's reasonable to conclude that this is a bias that is probably everywhere.
Yes, and after my end credits, I'm going to be looking at some aspects of a study done in my home state of Victoria about the sentencing gap. Now, it's not as comprehensive or fair as Sonia Starr's study, but I think it doesn't hurt to have a look at another source. And there's some interesting things there I also want to criticise. But for now, back to Thomas.
Now, I've talked about mass incarceration quite a bit on this podcast. Now, here's something that's probably depressing, but it's a mixed bag. So this is decreasing. This discrepancy is decreasing because the number of women in prison has been increasing at a rate 50% higher than men since 1980. So the system is catching up.
Well, no. The study doesn't say that. If I've missed that somewhere, someone please point it out to me. But I'm pretty sure Sonia Starr's study does not say that. So this is an assumption made by Thomas, right? Because the number of women being incarcerated is increasing and the number of men being incarcerated is dropping. That doesn't necessarily mean that the sentencing gap is closing. An alternative explanation could be that there are simply more women committing crime and the rate of males committing crime has dropped. In some areas this is definitely the case. I can't say, though, whether that's the case across the board.
The patriarchy or somebody, I don't know who, is catching up and has decided, you know what, it's time to no longer be soft on women. We need to get them in prison at a higher rate. But
it's ironic that he would say that the patriarchy is catching up on women, considering that a lot of feminists use patriarchy as an excuse for women getting lighter sentences. When you point out that women typically get less sentences for exactly the same crimes committed by men with the same criminal history, the standard response is, well, yes, that's discrimination against women because the patriarchy sees them weaker than men. So, yeah, it's funny that you would say that about the patriarchy, Thomas. It's more than a little ironic, especially considering there are feminists who are arguing that women should get lesser sentences because women are typically more defenseless than men, or more caring, or more nurturing, or less likely to be bad. It seems whenever a woman commits a crime, there is a long list of explanations explaining why she had no agency and was perfectly helpless, and it's usually the fault of the patriarchy or a man, and she's just an innocent victim. But of course, when men commit crimes, they have full autonomy and have to take full responsibility. It's an incredible argument coming from a group of people who claim that they're against gender roles and gender stereotypes. It seems that they like the patriarchy when it suits them.
It's still very big. So the discrepancy does seem to be real. I've read this entire study. It's very deep. It's very dense. But it seems pretty sound, and I'm not going to make too many bones about the data. I will say one thing that, once again, I said this a lot last time. If MRAs want to open the Pandora's box of the data, be ready to find that in actuality, who's getting the brunt of the mistreatment is people of color.
Actually, Thomas, that's not true. Now, if you had have said black men, I would agree with you, because black men get hit twice. They get hit with gender and with race. If you're going to say it's black people in general, though, then you're mistaken. Now, it is true that black women will typically get longer sentences than white women, but white men will get longer sentences than black women. So yes, race is a factor, and we should be talking about race as well. But gender is a bigger factor than race. So I have no problem talking about black men and race when it comes to sentencing. But we shouldn't stop there. We shouldn't only talk about black men. We should be talking about men in general. Because as you have just admitted, it is something which affects men in general.
And this remains true. Now, black men explain a significant portion of this discrepancy, but not the whole thing. So remember when I talked about the homelessness rate, and it's actually true that if you took out people of color, men and women were homeless at a very similar rate. And so therefore, if you're going to those arguments for why, like men are mistreated, you really ought to be arguing that we're mistreating people of color. And I emphasized that at the time. This time, it's not exactly true. So while it is true that if you take out people of color, or specifically black men and women, then the gap reduces. So it goes from something like 63% to somewhere around 50%. So that explains a portion of it. We just really treat black men differently in this country, and we sentence them more harshly. But that's not even the majority. That's not even half. Going from 63% to 50% means that there still is significant discrepancies in our sentences between men and women. And I want to give this argument credit. It does seem to be, in my opinion, this seems to be the place where sexism, or I don't know what you want to call it, but discrimination is going against men in this instance.
Now, I do find it strange that Thomas Smith is being so reasonable when it comes to the sentencing gap, because he hasn't been reasonable concerning men's issues up until now. In his first podcast about the red pill, he is incredibly biased and unfair, and I'll be tackling those arguments in future episodes in this series. And in the first half of his part 2, which was the previous 2 videos in this series, once again, he was incredibly unfair and biased. Yet here he's being reasonable. And I don't know why this one particular issue is being treated different than the others. I mean, the others, he basically bent over backwards to dismiss them any way he could. But this one, he's actually acknowledging and admitting that it's an issue. And it seems strange that he would do that. Now, I guess I could speculate that maybe he realizes that if he dismisses the sentencing gap for gender, then someone else can dismiss the sentencing gap for race. And he is a big proponent of the racial sentencing gap. So maybe he doesn't have any choice but to acknowledge that there is a gender sentencing gap as well. Or maybe it's some other factor. I'm not sure, but I just find it strange that he is so incredibly biased up until this point, and now he's being somewhat reasonable. It just seems strange to me, that's all.
I do want to point out there's a couple places where the system really strongly disfavors women, and that is when it comes to killing your intimate partner. So, and once again, this is heteronormative, but when it's a man who kills his wife, the sentence is actually usually less than a wife who kills the husband.
Now, Thomas doesn't actually give us a citation for this claim, but it is something I've heard before. In fact, I did a video on it, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. Now, where I'd heard this claim before was on a Facebook feminist page called Unpacking the F Word. And what it said was, the average prison sentence for men who kill their intimate partners is 2 to 6 years. Women who kill their partners are sentenced on average 15 to 17 years. Yeah, okay. A pair of Maryland cases vividly illustrates this inequality in sentencing. In one case, a judge in Baltimore County, Maryland, sentenced Kenneth Peacock to 18 months for killing his unfaithful wife. The very next day, another judge in the same county sentenced Patricia Ann Hawkins to 3 years in prison for killing her abusive husband. Significantly, the prosecutor in the Peacock case requested a sentence twice as long as the one imposed, while the prosecutor in the Hawkins case requested 1/3 of the sentence imposed. So I had a look at these two cases when I made that previous video, and I found some interesting things. First of all, these cases were from over 20 years ago. So even if that was the case 20 so years ago, that doesn't mean that it's the case now. Things could have changed. But these are very bad cases to illustrate the point. Kenneth Peacock came home and found his wife cheating on him. He lost control and killed her. Now, obviously, that's not acceptable. I'm not saying he should have got off scot-free. Of course, he should have been sentenced to jail, right? No one's doubting that. But that's a very different set of circumstances to the other case. Patricia Ann Hawkins waited until her husband was asleep. Then she poured lighter fluid on him and set him on fire. So, clearly, in the Hawkins case, it was premeditated. And if a crime is premeditated, you tend to get a longer sentence. Also, pouring lighter fluid on someone when they're asleep and setting them on fire is a lot more extreme. It's a horrific way to kill someone. So, yeah, I'm not surprised she got a longer sentence. If you look at the actual facts of the cases, they're not similar cases at all, and they shouldn't be used as a comparison. Now, the Facebook post goes on to say, as many as 90% of the women in prison today, 2008, for killing men had been battered by those men. Now, Thomas actually repeats the 90% figure in a few minutes, which is what makes me think that he's got his information from the same place as this Facebook posting. And we'll have a look at that a bit later. But for now, back to Thomas.
And there's some speculation that this could be because when a woman has to kill her husband, has to kill, I say, when a woman decides to kill her husband, it's usually with a weapon. She has to use a weapon. That's why I jumped to that word. Whereas men often can kill their wives with their bare hands, and it's speculated by some that using a weapon, for some reason we see that even though the crime is the same, either way you've killed a person, somehow using a weapon is like viewed more harshly than not using a weapon when it comes to sentencing, which that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It seems to me that murder is murder, and premeditated is premeditated, and equivalent murders are equivalent. I don't see why the weapon should make a difference. One other thing to point out that I think is interesting is that something like 90%, depending on the source, I've seen 93%, I've seen a little less than that, 90% around of all women who are in prison for killing their partner were abused by their partner.
No. I think a more accurate way of putting it would be claimed to be abused by their partner. Now, obviously, in some cases this would be true, whereas in other cases it's just an excuse to try to get out of a murder. And to be perfectly honest, I have no idea what percentages are what. But it seems to be the standard defence when a woman kills a man. Basically just claim that you've been abused, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So let me give you a couple of examples of cases where the I was domestically abused argument was used, but clearly it was just an excuse. Probably the most obvious one was the Jodi Arias case, where she brutally murdered an ex-boyfriend. She shot him, I think she stabbed him a dozen times, and then proceeded to almost cut his head completely off. Clearly she's a mentally deranged woman who wanted revenge on an ex-boyfriend who had moved on with his life. And the entire thing was premeditated. Yet that didn't stop domestic violence advocates from coming out of the woodwork and defending her, claiming that she was the real victim and that brutal crime was actually an act of self-defense. Somehow, I'm not exactly sure. I guess she had to almost cut his head completely off just to be sure he was dead, right? Now, in that particular case, it didn't work, and she ended up going to jail. But let's look at another case from Canada where a woman attempted to hire a hitman. So her ex-husband left her, he got custody of their child, and he started a new relationship because his ex was, once again, mentally deranged. So she decided to hire a hitman. Unfortunately for her, the hitman she attempted to hire was actually an undercover cop who was recording the conversation. And he clearly asked her, "Has he ever abused you?" And she laughed and said, "No, he's never done anything like that." But when she was arrested and went to court, suddenly that changed. Suddenly she started saying that she was abused and it was an abusive relationship, and that's why she decided to hire a hitman to kill him, even though they'd separated. He left her, and from memory I think he was living in a different city. Somehow the accusation of domestic abuse justified attempted homicide. Somehow. I'm not exactly sure. But she ended up getting off with that one. So, you know, there's some nice justice there, right? So, look, I'm not suggesting that that's the case in every single case where a woman pleads that it was self-defense because of domestic abuse. But it is a handy get-out-of-jail-free card. Literally a get-out-of-jail-free card. And it seems to work a lot of the time. Another case that comes to mind was the English woman who was a violent alcoholic and had assaulted police officers, I think it was 11 times from memory. And she pleaded that she had been a victim of domestic abuse in a previous relationship. Why that's an excuse to assault police officers 11 times while drunk is beyond me, but each and every time she got off until eventually she stabbed her male partner in the back with a carving knife and then tried to cover up the assault, the attempted murder. So let me ask you a question. Let's say a man brutally murders his wife and then during the court case he pleads that he was a victim of domestic abuse, that he suffered domestic abuse for a decade and therefore was justified in killing her. Maybe it was physical abuse, maybe it was just a decade of mental abuse, but somehow this justified him killing her. Would anyone accept that? Would Thomas accept that? I think most people would call bullshit. Yet it's a very, very different attitude when a woman does it, which is kind of an important point, considering we're talking about the sentencing gap. But the question is, where does Thomas get the 90% figure from? Is it an accurate figure? Well, he doesn't give us a citation, unfortunately, but as I said earlier, the post from 3 or 4 years ago on Facebook also mentioned it, and that gave us the citation of the Michigan Women's Justice and Clemency Project. So if we find it on their website, it says, "When women strike back, 1. Facts about women who kill their abusers. Currently, there are approximately 2,000 battered women in America who are serving prison time for defending their lives against their batterers. As many as 90% of the women in prison today for killing men had been battered by those men. Now, you'll note that it says as many as, so it's not a clear figure, but it does have a citation, which is Alison Bass. Women far less likely to kill than men. No one sure why. The Boston Globe, Feb 24th, 1992. So the citation comes from a Boston Globe article from 26 years ago. And for the record, the Boston Globe article does not give a citation as to where they got the figure. Although I do suspect that they got the 90% figure from one of the people they interviewed in the article. Here's a little segment of that article.
Women may be emotionally abusive and damaging, rather than physically abusive, says Brown, author of a book called When Battered Women Kill. Even though women could theoretically equalize their lesser strength with a gun, they still don't perpetrate violence in very large numbers. The statistics show that most women do not become violent unless they are in fear of their own lives or their children's. In research on battered women who killed their male partners, Brown found the majority women were responding to threats against their children. And the rest had reason to believe that, after battering them for years, the men in their lives plan to kill them. Brown also found the rate of women who killed their partners has fallen 25% since the mid-70s, when many shelters for battered women were opened and police started adopting tougher policies on domestic violence. There has been no comparable decrease in the rates of men who killed their female partners. Of all the male-female partner killings in the United States, 61% of the victims were women.
Okay, a couple of things. So I wanted to give Thomas the best case scenario, and so I did some additional looking for the 90% figure, because maybe it's from a different source. That's possible. So I found it a couple of different places. There was an article on takepart.com called When Battered Women Are Punished with Prison, and it quotes the 90% figure here. It says roughly 90% of women behind bars for killing men were physically abused by their victims. Now it's got a citation, and that citation takes us to a fact sheet for battered women in prison, and if we find the 90% figure, once again it is Alison Bass, women far less likely to kill than men, no one sure why, the Boston Globe, Feb 24th, 1992. So it comes from the same article. And I also found the same thing on the ACLU website. So it's got here as many as 90% of women in prison today for killing men had previously been battered by those men. And when we check the citation, once again, it's the same newspaper article from 1992. So it's unclear exactly where this figure comes from. It may come from Angela Brown, but it doesn't really state for sure. And besides that, it's 26 years old. If it actually came from the Angela Brown book, it's closer to 30 years old. So it's not really an up-to-date stat. And this seems to be one of those things where you get these facts, in talking marks, on feminist websites. And when you trace the citations back, you usually find it comes from some article from 30 years ago or something, which doesn't clearly state how they came to that conclusion. So I have no idea why they have the 90% figure, how they came to that conclusion. How many of these women have murdered their husbands and then claimed to have been battered, and there's no evidence of a past history of battering apart from their word? I'm assuming they're included in this 90% figure. But there's two little interesting things from that section of the 1992 article I just read out to you. The first one is the last sentence. It's got, of all the male-female partner killings in the United States, 61% of the victims were women. That means 39% of the victims were male. That's over a third, which is a significant number. Now, the other thing I want to look at was the claim that the number of male victims has dropped since the introduction of domestic abuse shelters. Now, this makes sense, right? If a woman is being battered and there's nowhere for her to go, then she might resort to killing her partner. Now, the same claim is also made on the Michigan Women's Justice and Clemency Project. Almost word for word, in fact. I suspect they got this information from the 1992 Boston Globe article yet again. But there's an interesting thing to discuss here, and that is, if we had more shelters for men, would the number of female victims also decrease?
So that is an interesting wrinkle. I think we can talk more about that later on when we get to a segment on domestic violence, because that is a major issue of the red pill and one that probably might deserve its own episode because there's a lot to talk about. But anyway, those are some interesting variables in the whole thing. But it is true, nonetheless, big discrepancy between men and women. Sentences certainly are shorter for women. So then we want to talk about why, and it's actually, according to this study, if we're gonna keep referencing this study, which makes, I think, the best case for discrimination here, it's not really in the judge's hands. It's actually incremental differences at many phases in the process. So one thing this study did that Sonia Starr, the author, says that other studies haven't done is account for when there's no prison time or no jail time. They somehow factored that in, or she did, in order to make the scoring more fair in her mind, because other studies have found a lower discrepancy. And again, that's why I use the study. It's found the highest discrepancy. There are others that claim it's a bit lower, but we'll go with this one. Anyway, this study puts a lot of the burden on prosecutors. And as you know, I've talked about prosecutorial discretion because a lot of the sentencing guidelines are pretty rigid. They're pretty much, a matrix, which is what's the crime and what's the criminal history. And that wouldn't really allow for all that much discrimination, because if you fit into a certain box in the matrix, you get a certain number of years. So you can expect that if you control for those factors, while it may be true that men more often have criminal history, if you control for that, you would still expect to see a very similar result, but we don't. So it's actually alleged in the study that it's likely discrimination in multiple stages. So it's like a little bit of discrimination, largely in the hands of the prosecutor. Some of it is still in the hands of the judges. In fact, there's a major court case in 2005 called Booker that rendered these sentencing guidelines as advisory rather than mandatory, and many people thought that would increase the discrepancies, but studies have found that it hasn't increased them all that much because they still are widely used. But there is still some discretion there, so part of it can certainly be some sort of patriarchy, some sort of feeling among judges that, women are inherently less of a threat.
I find that last bit fucking hilarious, that he says it's some kind of patriarchy and judges see women as less of a threat. Now, I don't doubt that judges do see women less of a threat, but the fact that he's referring to it as patriarchy is hilarious, because that is the exact argument used by feminists when they are trying to widen the sentencing gap, when they're saying that, well, women shouldn't be sent to prison because women are less dangerous, women are less violent, prison is harsher for women. Of course, when someone is sentenced, gender should be irrelevant. Even if you agree that women are typically less violent than men, a violent woman should not get a discount because women are less violent. And men should not get a harsher penalty because, on average, men are more violent. That's ludicrous, yet that's the argument. The argument is women are harmless, so we couldn't dare sentence them to jail for murder or anything like that. And there's always an excuse. It's always there's always a reason why they did it. And that's something I wanted to look at after my end credits, but I've decided to go with something different. But just before then, I do find it funny that he's referring to it as patriarchal, and that's what the feminists are arguing for. So I guess we can now argue that feminism supports the patriarchy. Right, Thomas? But anyway, as I was just saying, I was going to talk about how we see women more sympathetic after my end credits, and I was going to go through a report on the sentencing gap from my home state of Victoria, which came out in 2010. But as I was researching the 90% figure used by Thomas and other feminists, I came across a very, very interesting article, or paper I should say. It was published in the Australian Journal of Social Issues, Volume 34, Number 3, August 1999. So I know it's almost 20 years old, but it has some very interesting things to say. So I've decided to go with that after my end credits, and I'll leave the Victorian report on the sentencing gap until next episode, because I've still got 10 minutes of Thomas talking about the sentencing gap to get through. So the bit after my end credits is a bit long, but I think it's well worth having a look at. Like I said, it has some very, very interesting things to say about women using self-defense as an excuse for domestic violence. Oh, and it doesn't cite a newspaper from 1992. It actually cites many, many studies. Anyway.
Women hit in self-defense. The overwhelming evidence that women are perpetrators of spouse abuse as much as if not more than husbands is beyond contention. Small and intensive investigations as well as large and extensive national studies such as those in the USA, UK and Canada attest to this. This has been accepted by many critics who have begun to reassess their views on domestic violence and to look for new options. ILO 1993, for instance, while stating categorically that domestic violence cannot be adequately understood unless gender and power are taken into account, notes also that working on the assumption that only women can be victims and only men perpetrators is not a sufficient lens for understanding violence, and adds that this is a challenge to all of us feminists to deepen our views. Nevertheless, the overwhelming evidence of the presence of husband abuse does not seem to have had an impact on theory and practice regarding domestic violence. The most common response to this evidence is that women assault the men who beat them, that is, they hit in self-defense. The argument here seems to have shifted from the position, husband abuse does not exist, held until recently, to husband abuse exists but it is a form of self-defense. However, there are several questionable points in this argument that are being overlooked. In the first instance, there is no valid empirical evidence to confirm this. Most studies supporting this point are based on research drawing on clinical and non-representative samples, including women who have been abused by their husbands, or who killed their husbands. In most cases these studies use perpetrators of husband abuse as their informants. They ask women to state whether they hit their husband in self-defense, and whether they think their behavior is a genuine form of self-defense, which is methodologically unacceptable. Obviously, the argument in favor of self-defense deserves more serious consideration. Let us start from the beginning. What do we understand under self-defense? A common definition of self-defense is the use of equal force or the least amount of force necessary to repel danger when the person reasonably perceives that she or he is in imminent danger of serious bodily damage or death. Walker, 1993, 208-1990. Hence, important for self-defense to occur is the fact that a. the wife is exposed to an imminent danger. b. this danger is expected to cause serious bodily harm or death. And c. that self-defense entails equal force or the least amount of force necessary to repel danger. Based on this, is there evidence to show that any of these elements of self-defense are present when the wife assaults her husband? Let us explore this question. 1. In the majority of cases, women abuse their husband when there is no imminent danger or threat of death or serious bodily damage. Pearson 1997a. 1997b reports that 90% of the abusive women of her study assaulted their partner because they were furious or jealous, or frustrated, and not because they tried to defend themselves. Summer 1994, in her Canadian study found that only 9.9% of abusive women stated that they acted in self-defense. Interestingly, the proportion of men acting in self-defense was 14.8%. In most cases, they fight not to prevent imminent danger of death or grave bodily harm, but to get even, to inflict injury and often to escalate the violent incident. In such cases, women responding to domestic violence are more likely to be combatant spouses than self-defending victims. Female-to-male violence entails fighting back rather than acting in self-defense. In most cases they are exchanging shove to shove, kick to kick, blow for blow or insult for insult. Renzetti, 1992. Saunders, 1988. Soterios Arantakos, Husband Abuse, Fact or Fiction. 239. Further, our study of the 68 cases of husband abuse Arantakos, 1998, shows that in most cases, women use violence to stop the buildup of tension. The alleged attack by the husband, which is thought to trigger the assault by the wife, presents no threat to the wife or the family. The wife does not seek refuge after the assault. She is in control of family life. And her assault exceeds the husband's alleged aggression. This is consistent with findings reported by Strauss 1993, who, after having supported the thesis of self-defense in previous publications see above, following new evidence argues now against it, noting that about as many women as men attacked their spouses who had not hit them during the one-year referendum period. A similar trend is reported by other writers. Mould, 1990. McNeely and Robinson-Simpson, 1988. Who show that in the majority of cases female assaults are not a response to male aggression. 2. Many studies have shown that in violent families women are more likely than men to strike the first blow. States and Strauss 1990, who asked husbands and wives to state who hits first when violence occurs in their household, reported that according to men, husbands strike the first blow in 44% of the cases, and their female partner in 44% of the cases. In 12% of the cases the respondents couldn't remember. But, according to women, husbands hit first in 43% of the cases, and wives strike the first blow in 53% of the cases. 5% could not remember. In our study Sarantakos, 1997, the findings are similar. 46% of the husbands reported that they gave the first blow and 48% claimed that the wife struck the first blow. Further, 41% of the wives stated that the husband gave the first blow, and 52% that the wife gave the first blow. In a small number of cases, women hit first in response to abuse on the part of the husband, but in the majority of cases, abuse was not preceded by wife abuse. Certainly, hitting the first blow does not necessarily mean aggression. And it does not mean that therefore the wife was not acting in self-defense. She may hit to prevent further damage, or to respond to husband's aggression. However, when taken together with the nature of husband's behavior that allegedly triggers abuse by the wife, with the nature and extent of wife-to-husband violence, and with the fact that abusive wives hit their partner repeatedly, do not seek protection after they assault their partner, and they're in control of their relationship. Sarantakos, 1998, hitting the first blow is an indicator of aggression more than of self-defense. 3. Women abuse their husbands more than once. In many cases, wives abuse their husband in every single violent incident, often for several years. This is not consistent with the notion of self-defense, which exists only if it is an isolated violent incident. Marullo and Krieger, 1996. The argument that repeated abuse is inflicted in self-defense is not convincing, also because self-defense often invokes severe retaliation on the part of the husband, and this normally deters women from repeating such actions. It follows then that if a woman hits her husband repeatedly for long periods of time, and he does not retaliate, the husband is in no position to assault the wife in the first place, and her aggression does not constitute self-defense. 4. Women, when asked to explain the reasons for assaulting their husband, list self-defense not within the major reasons. In our wife abuse study, Sarantakos, 1997, the 5 most common reasons given were, to resolve the argument first place, to respond to family crisis second place, to stop him bothering me third place, to defend myself 4th place, and to prevent it from happening again 5th place. In a more recent analysis, Sarantakos, 1998, the proportion of wives who stated that they assaulted their husband in self-defense was just over 10%. 5. Justifying spouse abuse on the grounds of self-defense is morally wrong and also inconsistent with current policies and principles. Accepting abuse on the grounds of self-defense, particularly when there is no evidence of imminent danger of death or grave bodily harm, suggests that we allow legitimate and justified domestic violence, which is not correct. Apart from this, if we accept self-defense as a justification of violence, all cases of wife abuse where the husband assaults his wife in response to her violent attacks and in order to defend himself must be equally accepted as legitimate and justified. A proposition which obviously is not acceptable. 6. Many women justify husband abuse not in terms of self-defense. In our husband abuse study, many abusive wives admitted having abused their husband, and accepted responsibility for it, or admitted having hit him and justified it or rationalized it by arguing that this act was not abuse, I just hit him, or that it was the fault of the husband, he made me do it, or he deserved it. 7. Many husband-partner killers do not act in self-defense. Studies show that the majority of women who killed their husbands or lovers did so not in response to prior abuse or a threat of abuse. In most cases they were violent and impulsive and had previous arrests and convictions. Mann 1990. Jurek, 1989. Jurek and Gregoire, 1989. The overall propensity of women to violence is high enough to suggest that they do not act in self-defense. In their study, McNeely and Robinson-Simpson 1988, found that women have a higher mean and median rate for perpetrating severe violence than men. They conclude that female aggression is not merely a response to male aggression. The notion that abusive wives abuse their husband in self-defense rests in most part on speculation. There are no studies which have examined in detail the complex issue of husband abuse, for example how the violent incident started, how it progressed to aggression, what was the nature of husband's aggression, what was the wife's response, etc., and which could demonstrate how husband abuse is constructed, and to what extent husbands contribute to their own plight. Although it cannot be denied that there are cases in which women abuse their husband in self-defense, the view entertained by many critics that husband abuse is nothing but a form of self-defense, or that most abusive women act in self-defense has no empirical basis.